March 6, 1944, 22,000 feet above Berlin, Germany. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler held formation in his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, scanning the crystalline winter sky through the armored glass of his canopy. The contrails of American bombers stretched ahead like chalk lines drawn across a slate-blue canvas. 660 heavy bombers, he had been briefed, the largest daylight raid yet against the Reich capital. His wingman, Unteroffizier Klaus Bauer, flew tight on his left, the yellow noseband of Jagdgeschwader 26, visible even at this distance. They had climbed from Wernoken airfield 17 minutes earlier, vectored by ground control toward the bomber stream approaching from the northwest. The Americans came in daylight, confident in their tight formations and overlapping defensive fire. German fighters would attack from altitude, slash through the formations, then dive away before the escort fighters could respond. Standard doctrine, practiced hundreds of times. Except today, something was different. Stigler checked his rear quarter, a reflex born from 2 years of combat over Europe. What he saw made him key his radio immediately, his voice sharp with surprise cutting through the static. Enemy fighters, high and behind us, 7 o'clock, same altitude. The response from his flight leader came instantly. Identify type. Stigler stared at the aircraft closing from the west, their elliptical wings and distinctive nose profiles unmistakable even at this range. P-51 Mustangs, he transmitted, voice tight with disbelief. American single-engine fighters, here, over Berlin. That was impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The sighting reports that morning would trigger a cascade of analysis, technical evaluation, and strategic reassessment that would fundamentally alter German understanding of the air war. American single-engine fighters over Berlin represented not just a tactical surprise, but a collapse of assumptions that had governed Luftwaffe defensive planning for 3 years. The distance from Allied airfields in England to Berlin measured approximately 560 miles one way. Standard fighter doctrine held that single-engine aircraft lacked sufficient fuel capacity to fly such distances, engage in combat, and return home. This assessment had been validated repeatedly through 1943. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings provided escort to bomber formations, but both types had demonstrated clear range limitations. The P-47, despite its ruggedness and firepower, could barely reach the German border before fuel constraints forced it to turn back. The P-38, with its twin engines and greater fuel capacity, could penetrate somewhat deeper, but still fell hundreds of miles short of Berlin. This range limitation had been the foundation of German defensive strategy. Luftwaffe fighter commanders knew they could wait, allow the escort fighters to reach their operational limits and turn back, then attack the bombers when they were most vulnerable, deep over German territory. The tactic had worked devastatingly well. The August 1943 raid on Schweinfurt had cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers from 376 dispatched, a catastrophic 16% loss rate. The October 14th raid on the same target, remembered grimly as Black Thursday, had cost another 60 bombers. These losses were unsustainable, approaching rates that would consume entire bomber groups within months. The American strategic bombing campaign had been teetering on the edge of failure, not because German anti-aircraft defenses were impenetrable, but because unescorted bombers deep over Germany faced Luftwaffe fighters that could attack repeatedly without interference. General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, and one of Germany's most experienced fighter commanders, had stated the defensive principle clearly in conferences throughout 1943. Our advantage lies in geography and fuel mathematics. American fighters cannot reach Berlin. They lack the range. Therefore, targets deep in Germany remain defenderable. We need only maintain sufficient fighter strength to exploit the period after escort fighters turn back. This assessment was not wishful thinking. It was based on careful analysis of captured American aircraft, intelligence reports from combat encounters, and simple fuel consumption mathematics. A P-47 Thunderbolt carried 305 gallons of internal fuel. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine consumed approximately 85 gallons per hour at cruise power settings. This yielded an endurance of roughly 3.5 hours. At the Thunderbolt's cruising speed of approximately 280 miles per hour, maximum range was approximately 950 miles. But this calculation assumed no combat, no reserves, no margin for navigation errors or adverse winds. Practical combat radius was perhaps 400 miles from base, barely sufficient to reach the German border. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin Allison engines, carried 410 gallons of internal fuel in wing tanks. Each engine consumed approximately 60 gallons per hour at cruise power. Combined fuel consumption was 120 gallons per hour, yielding endurance of approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. At a cruising speed of 290 miles per hour, this provided a maximum range of roughly 960 miles, or a practical combat radius of perhaps 450 miles, still far short of Berlin. German intelligence had tracked these American fighters carefully throughout 1943, documenting their performance, noting where they turned back, calculating their limitations. The assessments filed with Luftwaffe High Command had been consistent and confident. American single-engine fighters do not possess sufficient range to escort bombers to targets in central Germany. The bomber formations will remain vulnerable during the critical phase of operations over the Reich. Yet on March 4, 1944, P-51 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group had escorted a small bomber force to Berlin. Weather and coordination problems had limited the effectiveness of this first mission, with only 32 bombers reaching the target, but the significance was unmistakable. American fighters had reached Berlin. 2 days later, on March 6th, they came in force. Franz Stigler watched the Mustangs closing from behind his formation, his mind racing through tactical calculations even as his hands moved automatically, adjusting throttle and trim. The P-51 seconds held altitude advantage, perhaps 500 feet above his starfall. They were positioned perfectly for a bounce, diving from above and behind, using gravity and surprise to achieve devastating speed advantage. This was the classic fighter attack profile, except German fighters were supposed to be executing it against American bombers, not defending against American fighters over their own capital. His flight leader's voice crackled through the radio, terse and professional despite the shock. All aircraft, prepare for defensive maneuver. The Mustangs are engaging. Break on my command. Stigler tightened his grip on the control column, eyes fixed on the lead Mustang, now perhaps 800 meters behind, and beginning its dive. The American pilot would have full advantage. Speed, position, surprise. German doctrine called for a hard brake turn toward the attacker, forcing an overshoot, but that meant abandoning the attack run on the bombers, the entire reason they had climbed to intercept. The Mustangs dove. Their pilots, men of the 4th Fighter Group who had transitioned from P-47 Thunderbolts just days earlier, executed textbook attacks. They came fast, closed to firing range within seconds, and unleashed concentrated bursts from their 650 caliber machine guns. The sky erupted with tracer rounds, bright lines of orange and red converging on German fighters. Stigler's starfall broke formation, each pilot instinctively turning hard into the attack, spoiling the American gun solutions. Bauer's Bf-109 rolled right and pulled into a climbing spiral. Stigler went left, hauling back on the stick until grey tunnels crept into the edges of his vision, pulling 4, perhaps 5 Gs, the Messerschmitt shuddering at the edge of high-speed stall. The lead Mustang flashed past, overshooting as Stigler's brake forced it wide. But there were more, many more. A second P-51 appeared in Stigler's windscreen, positioned perfectly as if the American pilot had anticipated the defensive brake. Machine gun fire stitched across his left wing, punching holes through the thin aluminum skin. Stigler reversed his turn, rolled inverted, and pulled through into a split S, diving away from the engagement. The negative Gs threw him hard against his restraint harness, Dust and debris from the cockpit floor floated into his face. The altimeter unwound rapidly as the Messerschmitt plummeted through 20,000 feet, then 18,000. Stigler pulling out level at 15,000 feet, scanning frantically for threats. 2 Mustangs followed him down, maintaining pursuit with an aggressiveness that suggested they had fuel to burn. Fuel to burn. Over Berlin, the implications crashed into Stigler's consciousness with the same impact as machine gun rounds punching through his wing. These Americans were not flying at the edge of their fuel reserves. They were fighting with confidence, pressing attacks, maintaining pursuit. They had range. Somehow, impossibly, the Americans had solved the Escort fighter problem. Stigler poured emergency power into his Daimler-Benz engine, the manifold pressure gauge climbing into the red as methanol water injection boosted output. The Bf-109 accelerated, reaching 340 miles per hour in level flight, but the Mustangs behind him matched his speed, effortlessly. At this altitude, approximately 15,000 feet, the P-51's Packard-built Merlin engine produced superior power compared to the German Daimler-Benz 605. The Americans were not just keeping pace, they were slowly closing the gap. Stigler pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed, diving toward the relative safety of lower altitudes where the Bf-109's performance improved. At 8,000 feet he leveled off, airspeed now exceeding 400 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt's controls heavy and sluggish at this speed. The Mustangs, remarkably, were still there, still pursuing, their pilots demonstrating either exceptional skill or dangerous overconfidence, or both. The chase continued for another 90 seconds before the Americans broke off, pulling up and turning back toward the bomber stream they were escorting. Stigler watched them go, his breathing heavy, sweat soaking through his flight suit despite the freezing cold at altitude. His left wing showed multiple holes, the fabric covering the ailerons torn and flapping, but he was alive, and his aircraft was flyable. Others in his staffel had not been so fortunate. The radio traffic told the story in fragments. Schmidt's aircraft was trailing smoke, descending toward an emergency landing. Bauer was calling Mayday, his engine dead, preparing to bail out. The entire intercept had collapsed within minutes of the Mustangs engaging, the carefully planned attack on the bomber formation abandoned as German fighters struggled simply to survive. The bombers proceeded to their targets unmolested. Back at Verneuken airfield, Stigler's debriefing lasted over an hour. Intelligence officers questioned him repeatedly about the Mustangs, their performance, their tactics, their apparent fuel reserves. How long did they remain engaged? Did they show any indication of fuel conservation? What altitude were they operating at? Did they appear to be at the limits of their range? Stigler's answers were consistent and deeply troubling to the intelligence officers taking notes. The Americans fought aggressively, with no apparent fuel concerns. They maintained pursuit for extended periods. They operated at high altitude, where the P-51 demonstrated superior performance to our fighters. They showed no indication whatsoever of being at their operational limits. If anything, they appeared to have substantial reserves. Similar reports flooded into Luftwaffe intelligence from every fighter unit that had engaged the Americans that day. The pattern was unmistakable and unprecedented. American single-engine fighters were now escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, engaging in prolonged combat over the target and returning to England. Every assumption about American fighter range had been shattered in a single mission. Major Heinz Baer, a veteran fighter ace with over 200 victories, submitted a combat report that captured the psychological impact. We are no longer fighting an enemy constrained by fuel and range. The Americans have achieved what we believed impossible. Their fighters now accompany bombers throughout the mission profile. Our previous advantage, the ability to wait until escorts turned back, no longer exists. We must now fight through fighter screens to reach the bombers. This changes everything. The question consuming German intelligence was simple and urgent. How? How had the Americans extended fighter range by over 200 miles? What technology or technique had they developed? The answer would come within days through examination of captured equipment and battlefield debris. but the immediate impact was already cascading through Luftwaffe operations. German fighter units had been organized and trained for intercept missions that assumed a specific tactical sequence. Bombers would approach Germany, escorted by fighters with limited range. German fighters would shadow the formations, waiting for the escorts to turn back. Once the bombers were alone, German fighters would attack in force, exploiting their numerical advantage against defenseless heavy bombers. This tactical doctrine had worked well enough to inflict devastating losses on unescorted bomber formations throughout 1943. Now it was obsolete. If American fighters could escort throughout the entire mission, German fighters would have to engage them first, before reaching the bombers. Fighter versus fighter combat was far more costly than attacks on bombers. Kill ratios were roughly even, unlike attacks on heavy bombers where a skilled German pilot could down multiple bombers in a single mission with relatively low risk. The strategic mathematics had shifted drastically against Germany. General Galland recognized the implications immediately. His assessment, submitted to Luftwaffe High Command on March 8, 1944, 2 days after the Berlin mission, was uncharacteristically blunt. The appearance of American long-range fighters over Berlin marks a fundamental change in the air war. Our defensive strategy was predicated on the assumption that enemy fighters lacked sufficient range to escort